Okay, Ethan, yet another yet another episode where we are hopping right into things. We have no, what I was thinking that we could start doing was, how Eric and Omar on Iron Culture have their uh little banter ritual, and they each say each other's names. I think we could fall into something like that eventually. But it's a little bit, I don't know. I don't know how I feel about the concept of a script.
Well, we do that and then we press play. So, maybe play a little sooner to record.
Yeah, yeah. Press the play button like four
I mean,
minutes prior.
my wife definitely doesn't think it's as entertaining as we do. And when I listen to Eric and Omar, like I am thoroughly impressed with their banter. I don't know. We might need a little bit more practice before we get there.
Yeah, yeah. Some training, some improv training, maybe. That would be useful. I think that would go a long way in terms of socialization. Anyway, so we're going to talk today a little bit about range of motion. Now, we've had a an episode already, don't remember. I believe, by the way, this is like episode, I don't know, 14, 15 or something. And I read some statistic recently that you are, as a podcaster, in the top 1% of podcasts in terms of number of podcasts put out if you've made 21 or more episodes, which is shocking. And it speaks to this concept of just attrition being being the main player and things. So, we're going strong so far. I think people are enjoying it, at least in terms of metrics that I'm seeing. Anyway, we've talked about range of motion and a lot of sort of tangential context so far. The one episode that was a little bit more dedicated was specifically in relationship to the conversation around stretch mediated hypertrophy, which still, I think, at the present moment is something not to be taken too seriously just from a mechanistic standpoint. I think, and when I say that, I just mean that it should be taken seriously as like an interesting concept, but not a concept that should basically take hold of your training and start to tug it in one direction in and of its of the principles of what we're seeing so far, which is basically just to say, like, exercises that are loaded in a more stretched position tend to seem to yield more robust hypertrophy responses in whatever you can call a one-to-one scenario compared to exercises that don't. So we kind of touched on that, and we have a separate episode kind of talking about that. So that will be sort of interwoven, I think, through this discussion, just through the topics that we end up talking about. But I don't want to make it a big point of discussion today, just because people can go listen to that one. But if it does come up, and if it does and if it is a little bit more relevant in listing certain examples, I think we can continue to touch on it, because I'm sure there's some things we haven't said. So when it comes to range of motion, a couple of the examples that you and I were talking about just through text, or that you sent me through text, were just examples where resistance directions of exercises that you pick don't really seem to sort of align with the goal of the range that you're training. And I think that what, generally speaking, just starting more broadly into this conversation, can be confusing for some people when we talk about range of motion is the fact that it's not just range of motion that we're looking at when we're talking about exercise, because in exercise, we're dealing with the range of motion of ourselves, right? Our joints, our muscles, connective tissues, the combinations of all those things. And then also this thing that we call resistance, which is you know, is a very important consideration, not only when it comes to range of motion, but just specifically like what goals you're accomplishing, right? Like the direction of any resistance that you use in any exercise is like the thing that differentiates that exercise from any other, right? The motion of a press can be exactly the same as the motion of a pull, and yet the only thing that really differentiates those two things fundamentally is the direction that you're resisting against. So just introducing that first and foremost, I think, is important as a to sort of like lay the groundwork for this topic. Is when we talk about range of motion, in exercise, range of motion in exercise is very distinct from looking at what the textbook says that a joint range is. And so, I think a common trap that people fall into is looking at, whatever they think is full range of motion, and then just grabbing a weight that sort of vaguely resembles something that could, load that motion, and then just going through that motion as if in terms of direction it made sense. So, I think maybe just to start off, we can start by defining the different kinds of range of motion. For me personally, my head just goes through range of motion of a joint, meaning, how far, within its own structure can a joint move? In other words, where can the bones move to? What are the motion capabilities of a joint? Obviously that's an independent thing and will vary based on people's structures, but broadly saying, we can say things like, the shoulder moves in 3 different planes, which, means it can move pretty much more than any other joint. The hip moves in 3 planes, which, means that it probably moves more than the knee and the elbow, and those sorts of things. And we can lay sort of boundaries for like, okay, the shoulder tends to have this many degrees of motion. But I think a more helpful place to go about this conversation, or to start from, is we have these things like active range of motion and passive range of motion. Which, active range of motion just being sort of like where we can actively contract into, whether that be sort of on it. And usually we talk about it in the context of a muscle shortening, but could also be in the context of a muscle lengthening. And then we have passive range of motion, which is where, someone or something else is kind of the thing that is doing the moving. Obviously contraction needs to be present at all times for your joints not to just fall apart. So even when someone else is doing the moving for you, like if someone is stretching you, for example, there is still some necessary amount of contraction that needs to occur in those positions. So in terms of active and passive, I'm sure many people listening have heard those terms before. It's not really a huge consideration in terms of exercise selection to me, outside of very specific contexts. But anyways, in terms of just introducing the idea of resistance direction being something that's important, and then active and passive range of motion being something that's important, is there anything else that you wanted to start off with, just in terms of this conversation as a whole, things that are more broad scopes, before we jump into any specific examples of kind of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, so you started breaking down like different things that we refer to as ranges of motion, and one of them was the joint range of motion, and then within that you could say there's sort of passive and active. There might also be the range of motion, say for a particular muscle that we're training, and that might align with the joint, but that may also play into the whole like direction of resistance thing. Like, are we still loading this muscle, or are we moving in a path that's in line with that the way that muscle pulls? And then there's also, I think, what more often goes sort of unsaid when referring to range of motion, which is just the implements, the
Mhm.
distance that the implement travels. And I think most of the time when people say range of motion, they're actually referring to how far the implement is going. And I think that's really where we get into some of the distinction here, when we're like, all right, this implement moves a greater distance through space, but then we have to ask what's moving, and do we want that to move? And then again, what's the direction of resistance? Therefore, what tissues are being loaded? And then we can get very specific into the goal, besides just saying that, more is better because you get more stuff.
Yeah, and I think a great example that we talked about last week, which that podcast will be releasing tomorrow as of today, was just the concept of a leg press, and the sort of, lower spine motion in a leg press, and how the foot plate visually moves farther back, closer to people's chests. And so people consider that to be better than stopping it a little bit earlier. But we talked last week about how, that is kind of coming from a place of, spinal motion, where we may not be trying to train spinal motion. So that's a good a potential example there. And that's an example where that motion will start to come from another joint or set of joints. So, in a leg press, it's like our hips and our knees and our ankles are moving back, and then our spine can start to take over, much like in a squat, and how that happens with a butt link. But it can also happen, like we can gain that extra motion by sort of being smushed into ourselves. So a good example may be like a barbell, bench press, or a Smith press. I see this happen a lot in, where it doesn't really like appear like much else is moving, but people's bones are kind of getting smushed in their we'll call it passive tissues, connective tissues that are not bone, are being sort of stretched to a greater degree to be pushed, to push someone into a position, i.e. the bar closer to their chest, when maybe actively they wouldn't be able to lower that amount. And, I think that has a lot more to do with just losing what I think of as control over the load, so in one instance, I think that more range can come through still controlled motion, but just controlled motion where you don't want it necessarily. So, lumbar flexion in the case of a leg press. But it can also come through motion at the same joint, but motion that's not under the sort of active category is kind of how I like to think of it. Because I think that, when we talk about like the active and the passive elements of contraction, those are both still, to me, within the confines of, am I controlling this motion with contraction? The whole passive range of motion thing is not something that I see as like extra beneficial. Another good example that may make sense in more people's heads is just like a pendulum squat, like getting smushed into the bottom of a pendulum squat, where the weight can really just compress everything down together, where you might not, again, be sort of actively controlling the contraction of, let's say, your quads in that one scenario. So I think we have these different categories of losing control between motion at, joints that are not supposed to be moving, but then also losing control where we may just lose control of the contraction of the primary tissue, and we may just start to move into the passive elements of that specific joint. Does that distinction kind of make sense?
Yeah. And I think, naturally from this, we start to think about, well, what might the consequences be? I'm thinking of examples of that leg press that I've seen. And, on one hand, like we talked about last week, they may be able to use less load. And the explanation may be, well, I'm going through, a greater range of motion at, say, the knee joint, for a leg press, or the hip joint. And maybe some of that motion is coming from the lumbar spine, but at the same time, we see it represented at the knee as well, where the knee clearly is going through more motion. So then I guess the question becomes like, well, what gets you out of that position? And to say that there's no quad involvement, that it's all just lumbar spine to get out of that position, or back extensors to get out of that position, I think would be false as well. So
Yeah.
I think, it would be interesting for me at least to talk a little bit about like, well, what might happen out of that position, because, whether it be like let's say a triceps exercise where you're able to achieve greater, elbow flexion with the cable pulling you back, bench press, like you mentioned, leg press, people are able to still use pretty significant loads, feel, good contraction. What are your thoughts as far as like what might be happening, out of the lengthened position there, and how they're able to achieve that?
Yeah, so I think a really good example to use first will be like something like a pendulum squat-esque hack squat, any sort of just highly anchored, constrained lower body pressing scenario. Because there is a very big difference, or there can be, in terms of range. So the first scenario is sort of one in which the person lowers down, they get to a point where they're really actively, pushing into the platform to lower themselves, like they're not letting any inch of that range not be controlled. And they sort of go down, 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 and they get to like, most of their knee motion, basically to the point where, their calves are sort of starting to smush against their hamstrings toward the bottom. And there's a moment at which you could choose to continue to push into the platform actively to control the motion. Or you could choose to sort of let go of that a little bit and almost sort of relax into the bottom. And so to me, that extra range still comes at the we'll say, or under the control of the quads, right? Because you are still knee flexing to a greater extent and having to knee extend out of it, right? So there is technically a greater range of motion at the knee. But to me, the way I sort of like to think about it is, in that first scenario where you're sort of controlling yourself down, you get to the point where your tissues approximate and then you sort of smush everything together to get a little bit lower. That would be scenario A. And then scenario B would be you sort of get to that point and you don't go to the smushing degree. You go maybe to just to where you feel the contact of the calf to the back of the hamstring and then back out. Those two scenarios usually to people feel like I'm controlling the weight down in 100% and back up. Whereas the sort of what we'll call the smushing variation is like I'm controlling the weight 95%. And then there's this moment where there's this like relaxation where I almost lose it. And then I have to kind of regain it almost out of the bottom. So to me, it's really to the way that I sort of frame it in terms of understanding it is, in one instance, there's a relaxation of what we'll call, to be honest, I think it's probably also the quads too in this particular case, but there's certainly a greater relaxation of the tissues that stabilize the knee, like the gastroc and all of the hamstrings. There's a relaxation, like a lowering of contraction, right? Because and this is maybe just something broadly for people to understand is when you create contraction, your muscles bulge, right? Like that's like the simple way to think about it is your muscles bulge and they change shape and they get hard when they contract. Like for the most part, there's usually the sort of tenderness that muscles have when you're just sort of flopping them around. But the second that you go to contract a tissue, it becomes hard, right? Like people know that, right? But when it comes to range of motion, in order to lose that stiffness of the contraction, in other words, in order to lose the 100% controlled range of motion, what you have to do is you actually have to let go of some of that control, and you have to let go of some of that shape change that you've created, some of that stiffness that you've created to continue to move through range of the joint. So to me, in the instance of the smushing pendulum squat, the smushing hack squat, we are 100% controlled to the point where we've still got that really sort of rock hard contracted feeling in our tissues, in our gastroc, in our hamstrings and whatnot. And when we go past that point and we sort of smush to that bottom 5 to 10%, what we do is we actually, again, essentially move away from maintaining that rigid shape. So more range of motion at the joint does occur, but the only way that more range of motion can occur at that point is if we actually lower the degree of tension that we ourselves are creating actively and trade that off for tissues that need to take on that load, we'll say passively. So for me, where that load gets sort of redistributed more in this particular case is more toward, like, we'll say connective tissue of the knee, like patellar tendon type stuff, like ligaments of the knee that hold the knee together, right? ACL, PCL, LCL, all those guys, the meniscus, right? All those sorts of soft tissue structures that actually control motion. And in addition, you have fluid shifts within the joint that occur to actually allow bones to move further. So bones can be moving further and more closely approximating, in this case, a more knee flexed, knee bent position. But what is controlling that motion in my, under my current paradigm is not sort of the things that we want, or aren't the things that we want to be controlling that motion. So a similar example would be, like a triceps extension you mentioned as another example, where we can kind of get to a point where we're really sort of maintaining a good amount of tension on the triceps, but we can also sort of smush our forearm past that point, almost to a point where we get our elbow flexors, like our biceps, to kind of relax so that we can smush our elbow a little bit closer together. And so in that particular case, it's like, beyond a certain point, the active elements of contraction by necessity have to actually decrease their output in order to continue moving farther. So in terms of my framework around it, I think that generally speaking, people can be in a place where they may not, again, feel these sorts of consequences acutely. It may be something that is sort of like this slower burn scenario. I just over time have leaned more in the direction of, if I cut 5 degrees, imagine it wasn't bad at all. imagine it like eventually it wouldn't create any sort of downstream negative consequence for my joint health. I just don't really think that kind of trade-off to me is the kind of trade-off that will make a difference in the outcome that we want to see, such that it would be worth taking that potential risk, if that makes sense. So does that framework of like how that motion is occurring kind of make sense in terms of, that's that sort of thing that I'll call smushing, how that sort of motion creates, again, this appearance of greater range, but not necessarily under the constraint of our control.
Yeah, I think one good example in my training is when I came off of back rehab and I really wanted to bias everything away from axial loading.
Yeah.
And as far as and that's, going to be primarily lower body things like, squatting type motions. So I went, the other direction and said, all right, let me really just bias, an upright posture, like an upright trunk and a ton of knee flexion, which started doing a split squats and, high wedge using my body weight and then eventually the weight of the dumbbells, to push myself into greater knee flexion. And, before long that started becoming problematic, for the knees as well. And I think that was a good example of what you described as like, I couldn't ordinarily get into that level of knee flexion, but with a good amount of forward lean and load on it, I could push that extra range. Like I could use the load to push me into it.
Yeah.
And, when I'm doing other exercises like a leg press, for example, or, even like a hip loaded hack squat variation, those are things where, again, the direction of resistance, like, can vary a little bit, and that can influence, like you mentioned, the pendulum squat, for example, which is kind of, pushing you forward more so than just straight down. Mm-hmm. That can really influence like how much knee flexion you're being pushed into. But I think just allowing that load to take you there versus controlling yourself, getting into the position is a big difference. And definitely as far as knees and elbows go, I've noticed the consequences of that.
Yeah. Yeah. And to our, to kind of how I mentioned earlier, to start the conversation off, we have different degrees of range at these different joints. So, shoulders and hips tend to get away with a lot more because there's a lot more sort of like a built-in, I'll say, range buffer. Like the hips kind of have the buffer of the spine. The shoulders in and of themselves have sort of built-in buffers in the structure of the shoulder blade and the clavicle and how much they move, and how, if you don't have enough range, we'll say at your GH joint, you can kind of make up for it through a shrug and those kinds of things. But we don't really have those options at the knees and the elbows, which is why I think it tends to be more of an immediate feedback with those kinds of things, just from a structure standpoint. And I think that this also kind of leads us into the conversation as well, this whole passive active control thing of just how much the concept of range of motion or mobility, if we want to call it that, is in flux. So, for example, I'm sure everyone listening has at some point taken a long car ride. It's like the range of motion that you could actively test for after that long car ride will be drastically different, whether you measure it 1 second after you get out of the car versus 30 seconds. You could take 5 steps forward and all of a sudden it would be like, oh, now I've gained X degrees of hip motion. Now I've gained X degrees of hip rotation. And I think the takeaway there is that the range that we observe, whether it's in an exercise or whether it's in some kind of table test or some sort of mobility test, is always dependent on the current needs of the scenario, which again could be, have you been sitting for an hour? Did you just go for an hour-long walk? Because again, the range that you observe will be very distinct, and the body and the brain is very, very good at sort of making those choices in the moment and saying, okay, what ranges of motion do I need at this time? Do I need to be able to rotate my hip very much if I'm sitting on my ass, like watching Netflix for 3 hours? Like probably not. So my brain is going to tighten up. It's going to stiffen up the tissues relative to whatever position I happen to be in. And then once I start moving around, maybe I take a few steps and I feel like, oh fuck, I'm stiff. But lo and behold, a minute later, it's like now you're essentially a different human being. So I think it's important to mention that I think range of motion is always something that is constantly changing depending on scenario, and not only just those kinds of scenarios that I listed that are maybe like you're sitting versus you're not sitting, but also just things that come to mind in terms of exercise specifically are like, what kinds of implements are you using? Are you using a fixed implement? Are you using a free moving implement? Because the ranges that you observe in those instances can be very different. Are you doing a free weight squat? Right? Because if you're doing a free weight squat and you have to work around the constraints of not falling on your ass or falling forward, you may appear to have very little hip range of motion, when in fact it was just the physics of the exercise that essentially made it seem that way. You mentioned the pendulum squat and how the resistance direction is more sort of forward shoving rather than up to down. That can create a specific appearance of having an amount of knee range that you maybe wouldn't, in a free weight squat. So these things to me are just so context dependent that when it comes to the conversation of range of motion, I tend to just think very like hyper specific in terms of the scenario. And just how much range we have depending on that scenario, because it sounds kind of silly to say, but if you use an amount of load on an exercise that is too heavy, quote unquote, for the top 50% of the range, the shortened end of the range, then your range of motion will be 50% of what you might imagine having no load, right? So your range of motion also changes depending on your quote unquote strength and sort of your internal torque against the external torque and everything like that. So that's I think a much more helpful framework rather than saying like more is better or less is better, kind of a thing. So that's kind of where my head goes on that. Did you have anything that you wanted to mention about any of that?
It'd be interesting to get into, we've mentioned this like direction of resistance thing a few
Yeah.
times. I think like our sort of archetypal example here would be like dumbbell internal external rotation. Like guy picks up 5 pound dumbbell, starts, keeps his elbow flexed and is swinging the thing through space. Like, number one, why is that, not training what he or she thinks it is? And, maybe what is it doing? Like, how is that person achieving that? And that might be a good segue into some other common exercises where maybe the direction of resistance doesn't line up as well as, what one might think, or maybe is achieving something different than they intended to.
Yeah. So when I was thinking about how to lay out this conversation for people in the personal training mentorship, it's a very you could take it multiple directions, and you could like really, really break it down to the level of like needing to understand everything about moment arms and planes of motion and uh like force components and those kinds of things. But I think very simply that whenever we're trying to figure out like, okay, what muscles is this exercise working? Like what tissues are being trained? We can always pretty easily answer that question basically by saying, okay, where are my bones moving? And then what is the direction of the resistance relative to where my bones are moving? And so a rule that I like, a sort of like a first principle rule that I have laid out in terms of like first principles of coaching is you need to first have this aim of like, you have this motion in mind of like, okay, here are the motions that I want to do. So in this example, right, for anyone watching on YouTube, it would be like one of those examples where someone has a dumbbell, right, and they're holding a dumbbell and they're standing up and they're doing like an internal and external rotation, right? And anyone who's ever done this and felt this knows that it doesn't feel like a shoulder rotation thing. It feels like a biceps thing. And that principle of look at where the bones are moving and look at the resistance direction, I think we can make a sort of better rule, or we can create better guidance based on that idea of, okay, what is my aim? So what motions am I trying to train, just based off of just, nothing super specific, nothing like muscle specific yet, but just like where are my arms or my legs moving? Um, you know, where are those bones moving? And then how can I make whatever resistance I'm using parallel to where those bones are moving? So in the example of the internal and external rotation, if I think about, how my forearm is sort of moving left to right, I know that with the rule of like, okay, where are the bones moving, make the resistance parallel to the bones, that I would need to, in this case, make the resistance like a cable resistance that's going side to side with my forearm, or a dumbbell where I'm sort of laying, on my left or my right side in order to actually load that. So, in the case of the normal standing dumbbell internal and external rotation, what essentially is doing the resisting in that instance are the muscles of the elbow that basically have to prevent the hand from going downward. And so, you have this interesting mismatch of like, well, the resistance is, perpendicular to the floor basically, but my motion is parallel to the floor. So you either want the resistance and the motion to be both perpendicular or both parallel, right? In this particular case, and if you're using a dumbbell, you have to have your bones moving perpendicular, because the dumbbell hopefully is always moving toward, the center of the earth. But I think stepping back, broad scopes approach to this in my own head in terms of how we can look at the whole resistance direction thing is ultimately coming back to, do I have resistance directions that are moving parallel to the direction that I'm moving my bones? That to me is the fundamental thing. And at a more specific and technical level, the whole parallel bones thing is not 100% accurate technically, because we're really talking about like plane of motion, right? Because like when you're moving when you're rotating your shoulder internally and externally in that sort of elbow bent position, what is doing the moving to most people looks like the hand, right? But it's actually the shoulder. So, you're not necessarily looking at plane of motion when you say, okay, I'm like moving my bones over here, but that's in essence what you're talking about. And I think that even though technically it's slightly off base, I think that from an actual practical application standpoint, there is nothing simpler to me than saying, where does this implement want to move my bones and where am I actually moving them? And how does that relate to, where the implement is trying to move me? So is that kind of the direction that you saw that
Yeah.
going, or wanted to take that?
As a follow-up, like let's say you could isometrically hold, a 30-pound dumbbell, elbow flex, elbows bent.
Yeah.
What would stop you from internally and externally rotating from that position? Like, is there then, any load on those muscles internally and externally rotating, or is it just something else? So some sort of like co-contraction or something that would stop you from being able to do that?
Yeah. So I think a really good example is like, I think we talked about it this week with the forearm motion, and people who are listening can do this. If you just doesn't really matter what position you have your elbow bent in. But if you can just sort of pronate and supinate, like just sort of twist your, hand around and just feel how much range you have there. And then you can kind of squeeze your hand as hard as you can and don't like let your fingers sort of unravel. Like make sure, you could squeeze something like your phone or whatever, but just make a strong fist and then try to actually rotate your forearm. And what you'll realize is there's still a little bit of wiggle room, but to be able to actually like rotate your forearm and internally and externally rotate your hand, what you have to do is you have to make sure that you're not squeezing something too hard. And that's because the muscles that are involved in the squeezing of the hand basically compress the elbow together, right? So when you create force in what we'll call one specific plane, you mitigate the potential of motion in other planes. So in this example of, holding we'll say a 30 or a 40-pound dumbbell, what would limit the motion side to side there is simply the fact that all of the tissues that are performing the motion that you're loading, right? So in this case, we'll say biceps, both biceps and obviously other elbow flexors. all of those muscles, to some degree, want to hold the shoulder in one position, not only because of how the biceps are actually interacting with the shoulder and how they're sort of acting as like a joint compressor of the shoulder, but also because of all the associated contraction that needs to occur on the opposite side of the same joint to be able to basically hold it there. So when you have this very high demand in these couple of muscles, you have to have this sort of concomitant response in other muscles that stabilize the same joint. And if you try to create motion in a direction that is not the direction of the actual load that you're using, then it starts to become very complicated for the brain. You kind of have to choose between one or the other. Do I choose to hold this thing that I can actually hold with my strength of a 30-pound dumbbell, or do I pick up a 2.5-pound dumbbell and start waving it around because it's so low load that there's no necessity to limit any motion? So I think a good takeaway from that example is, if you are actually using a challenging load for an exercise, you will only be able to really move in one plane. In other words, you will only really be able to move those bones parallel to the resistance. You will not be able to move the bones in a direction that would be perpendicular or closer to perpendicular to that resistance, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I can think of a few other examples that, I've just seen in the gym that kind of exemplify this. Like, been watching someone warm up that does side planks and then adds like hip flexion, from a side plank. So they're laying, let's say, on their left side, they come up, into
Yeah.
a plank and then take their right leg and start moving that as if they're, running, like knee towards, chest motion.
Mm-hmm.
And it, looks real like functional and athletic and everything. But I'm just thinking to myself, well, again, this kind of comes back to the, direction of resistance thing. Like, we're not really loading, hip flexion at all in this position. Like, you probably still feel your hip flexors working, or you feel something happening there. Because at the end of the day, like, they are still, lengthening and shortening, but just not, under load. Whereas the load in this case, if you're on your side, is going to be more on the hip abductors.
Yeah. And you could take the extremes of this and be like, if I'm going to raise my arm up and out to the side, I can't simultaneously raise it down and toward my body, right? It's just a slight derivation of that same logic, right? Like, if I'm actively pushing out, I can't push in. So if I'm actively pushing out as hard as I can, I'm not going to, you ever see those exercises where people will, they'll like raise the dumbbells forward and then they'll do like a bunch of stuff, and
Yeah,
they'll, yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. And for the listener, I'm raising my arms to the sides and then moving them so that my hands are close together and then moving them out to the sides again. And it's like, if you were using a load that was appropriate for your middle delt, you probably would not be able to move your hands so much out in front of you. And if you were using a load that was appropriate, let's say for like pecs and front delts that would pull your arm inward, then you would not be able to resist anything in the downward, direction in that case. So again, if any of these examples were confusing for people to visualize or see, the basic point is the limitation and also the benefit of the weight room is we really only have this capacity to load in a single direction. And if you are moving in more than one direction, right, in more than one, what we call plane, then you're probably not really getting anything out of that particular exercise if you're able to do multiple things in the same exercise, right? It's kind of like the multiple birds to, or multiple stones to no birds analogy. So yeah, and you see that everywhere. Like, you see that in specific cases with like glute kickback motions. You see that with, this is the same reason why I wouldn't recommend that someone would like actively be trying to do squats with like a heavy band around their knees, right? It would make no sense to have your femurs moving inward and outward as you are trying to actually move them upward and downward, much in the same way. And also, I thought about this recently, but you never see anyone on the seated abduction machine with like a band that is pulling their leg upward, right? I mean, practical limitations on the upward part, because it's not like people can easily anchor the band on something above them, like that's like flying. But point being, move your bones in a direction that is parallel to resistance. To me, it always comes back to that. So you and I were talking about the dumbbell lateral raise example as well, and just the sort of range of motion that a lot of people are using on that exercise. Is there something that you wanted to point out about that?
I was actually doing cable laterals yesterday, and I thought back to just like some examples of classes I've been in where, they're maybe testing shoulder range of motion, let's say in flexion, where your arm's going overhead, whether it be on a table or whether people are just sitting in class and it's just like, okay, raise your hand. How far, can you make your arm go, over your head? And there's, multiple things, again, when we're talking about range of motion that can make a hand go higher. So I can get that from a shoulder. I can get that, from a shoulder blade. I can get that from a rib cage. There are lots of things that can change that appearance. And then again, when we come into the weight room, as you mentioned, the resistance can really change how far you can get into that range as well. And, I just think about, again, those things that bring us into that appearance of hand going overhead. And when I'm doing a lateral raise, I really get this sensation that like more of that motion seems to be coming from the shoulder versus say the scapula. And I could be wrong. Like I'm interested, in your thoughts on that. But I get that like I raise my arm as if, I'm not trying to go as high as possible, but I'm really just trying to move at the shoulder. If I started off with the intention of how high can I get my arm, I would coordinate that exercise very differently. And I think when bodybuilders talk about, how to make people feel lateral raises, they give exercises and descriptions that are things like reach outwards, push, stand in a doorway, push out against a doorway. And it seems to me like a lot of that motion, is coming more as like a glenohumeral, like shoulder motion versus a how high can I get the appearance of my hand motion. And I thought it might be interesting to talk a little bit about, where does that motion of getting your hand overhead come from, and how might that influence the goal of specifically loading the middle delt?
That was beautifully framed, Ethan. Um, yeah, so I really like starting backwards from like a common like cue that people give, like that cue of just reaching outward or reaching away from you, because I have heard that, and that cue can sometimes actually be useful. I think a good place to start here is just from the standpoint of understanding that the middle delt specifically attaches from the side of the shoulder blade to the upper arm. So what that means is that when it shortens, it will pull the shoulder blade to the arm, and it will pull the arm to the shoulder blade. Now you don't really see, you don't really see the shoulder blade being pulled to the arm because we have muscles that prevent that directly. What we usually see is just motion of the arm, like in a lateral raise. So when the upper arm is moving, you know that 100% of that motion, if you're in a very specific middle delt sort of exercise, when just the arm is moving, you know that the middle delt is doing the bulk of the work, right? Because it's anchored somewhere else and it's attached to the arm, so it can pull the arm up. But once we start to get, we'll say, toward like 90 degrees of having our arm out to our side, or sort of out to our side and in front of us, all these other things start to move in the scapula and the clavicle specifically. So to our conversation earlier about spine motion, and I'm getting deeper in a leg press because my spine is sort of rounding under me like a dog taking a shit. The sort of equivalent to this, and not that it's good or bad, right? But in the context of training the middle delt, when my scapula and my clavicle start to move a lot, what is doing the moving of those bones is not the middle delt, right? Is all these supporting tissues, traps, levator, serratus, right? All those guys. And so the distinction really between what we'll say is as a greater range of motion lateral raise and a partial range of motion lateral raise is not so much the difference between more middle delt because more range versus less middle delt because less range. It's more like, yeah, still we have a good amount of middle delt in this like quote full range of motion lateral raise, But we have a lot of other stuff that's associated with that motion, and that actually may limit, and often does limit, the ability to actually, we'll say, get through that full range. So we can think of the full range of motion lateral as this like really sort of omni blended exercise of like, you got a lot of delts going on there, you got a lot of traps going on there, you got a lot of serratus stuff going on there. But you have a lot of stuff that might prevent, again, people from feeling like their limiter is in their middle delt. And experientially, that tends to be what I see a lot, is people just feeling like they're blasting their traps with any kind of lateral raise. So then we sort of get to what we're calling the partial range, or where we're, I think the cue of like move your arms out to the sides, or like reach for the walls, those kinds of cues come from. Those cues are simply just cues to limit range going overhead, right? Because if your brain is thinking like, I need to move my arm in this horizontal direction, it's not going to try to coordinate any vertical motion along with you changing the direction. And so when people do that thing, or have that intention to reach to the wall, they are in essence just moving sort of within the territory of where the middle delt is actually going to do the most amount of work per the total range. So, from 0 degrees of raising my arm to about 90, it's pretty much like pure middle delt, and all those other muscles have a very low demand to support the shoulder joint. But from 90 degrees above, we have a ton of involvement, which mostly comes from muscles that move the scapula and that move the clavicle. And again, which isn't to say that all of a sudden your middle delt recruitment drops off the face of the earth, but as a proportion of muscle recruitment, you have basically a drastically lower amount of middle delt involvement in that top half of the range as compared to the bottom. So when we're considering what kinds of directions to load our arm, and we have in theory an unlimited amount of options in terms of the implements that we can use, I'm going to prefer to use an implement that can directly load the bottom half of the range, like a cable or like a machine that is built to do that, as opposed to a dumbbell, where the dumbbell really only starts to pick up its degree of loading where those other tissues start to become more involved, right? So why do so many people have this issue of like dumbbell laterals in their traps? It's like, it's just your body's and your brain's solution to the physics of the exercise. That has nothing to do with your lack of mind muscle connection or anything like that. It's just simply what is being called upon to manage that range at that particular point in the exercise. So there was, yeah, go ahead.
It seems like the follow-up to that oftentimes is like, well, if we can get middle delts and we can get traps and we can get levator and we can get serratus, like more is better.
Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit to like what a counter to that might be?
Yeah, I would just say that, there's no situation in which you get more of something without getting less of something else. Like, it's just this game of like of trade-offs that you're playing. And in my experience, like traps are something that are pretty much not pretty much. They, from a physical scenario standpoint, they are impossible to get rid of in any upper body exercise. So if you don't need more of any muscle group, it's probably it's probably traps and levator, which are holding your shoulders to your body 100% of the day, all day, every day. But just in terms of like because I do hear that presented a lot of like, well, if I could just get more of everything, then what would be the purpose of getting more of this specific thing and less of the others? And I would say, well, number one, like if it's your goal to get more of this one thing and less of the others, like many people say, like, oh, my goal with this exercise is to train my middle delt, then moving away from that, to me, is moving away from the aim. It's moving away from the goal. And in addition, what I would say is, if you are again getting more of those other muscles that you mentioned, by definition, you are getting less of a degree of recruitment in middle delt. And as a consequence, you're also potentially starting to overlap the stimulus of what you're doing with other things that you're applying that same logic to, right? Which may end up not only being redundant from a stimulus perspective, but also sort of counter to what an efficient program might look like. And when I say efficient, I just mean sort of easier to to organize, in the sense of like, I know if I'm doing this one thing and I know that this is the primary stimulus of this one thing, I also know that it's not the primary stimulus in this other activity, which may have previously, if I wasn't thinking about it, overlapped a ton, right? And then you start to get into situations where people are like, XYZ feels like shit all the time. I feel like XYZ isn't recovered every time I train it, like those kinds of issues. And yeah, middle delt, interestingly, I think not so coincidentally, is one of those muscles that people like really lack a mind muscle to. And they'll use logic like, oh, it's because it's a single joint, or oh, it's because it doesn't cross multiple joints. And I think that's wrong. So was there one other piece to that I missed, that you mentioned somewhere in the middle of that? Do you feel like I missed anything there? Um,
No, I think you pretty much tackled the lateral raise.
okay. Cool. Yeah. And just from a physics-based perspective too, a big part of the reason that the cables make such a difference is because if you are able to grab a cable and at the bottom of the range, like if you could picture like a Y raise type of setup where you're loading, directly 90 degrees from your forearm at the bottom, and it's like loading your arm sort of across your body, and you're doing this kind of a motion. By the time you get to that top end of the range where you would have had, we'll say theoretically, more trap recruitment, levator recruitment, serratus recruitment, whatever, you are, performing an exercise, which in terms of its resistance is drastically lowered. So even though you may end up in the same joint position in two different scenarios, the reason that this conversation of direction is so important is not just because of any one point in the exercise, but how the direction changes through the exercise. Because you could do that same motion and load it very differently, and the outcome in terms of the actual stimulus could be totally differentiated. So that's why to my point earlier about how resistance direction is sort of like the thing that determines what we're actually dealing with from a stimulus perspective, is because you can perform the same exact path of motion and have two totally different outcomes because of where in that motion you're actually loading your tissues the most, or loading your bones the most, I should say.
Makes sense, sir. Makes sense. Oh,
I think that in a future episode, in an updated episode, because I really like that you gave that example of like how you fucked up your knees kind of with the range of motion thing, or just with the assumption of range of motion. I think it would be good to go over some other examples with like shoulder stuff and stuff that you've experienced, like middle delts in particular. I know something recently has been not problematic for you, but just on the radar of things with that right shoulder, in terms of solutions there.
yeah, let's do it.
Cool.